In this video, I will be introducing cells, and as we start the unit on cells and cell function, so we'll talk about the different organelles, the parts of the cell, as well as how to differentiate between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. A eukaryotic cell is a cell that encloses its DNA in a nucleus or nuclei. So these are often bigger, more complex cells than prokaryotes. So if you look down at the bottom, the plant cell and the animal cell, those are examples of eukaryotes. And you can also think of this as you are made of eukaryotes. So I don't know, that's the way that I try to remember it. And then prokaryotes, those are cells that do not enclose their cell in a DNA. So that would be this little bacteria cell down at the bottom here. They're usually much smaller and less complex than eukaryotic cells. So as you can see, it doesn't have quite so many organelles. It doesn't have a nucleus. Its DNA is just kind of spread around in the cytoplasm down here. And these are just some examples of prokaryotes. You don't have to write these down, of course, but these are different types of bacteria. So the top here, you have Streptococcus, which is a type of bacteria that causes strep throat. Down the bottom, these little purple guys are Staphylococcus, which is a type of staph infection. And then these yellow ones are called Salmonella, which causes food poisoning. And a few examples of eukaryotes. If you look on the top here, this is a paramecium, which is a single-celled organism, kind of floats around in pond water. Down at the bottom here, these green guys would be a plant cell, so you can see the little chloroplasts. Those would be those little green circles there. And then to the right here we have human skin cells. So these are what our skin cells look like. This would be the nucleus here, and the cell membrane is what outlines it. So the cell is divided into basically two main structures, which would be the nucleus, which contains the cell's DNA, and with it the instructions for making proteins, and the cytoplasm, that's the fluid portion of the cell outside the nucleus. So that would be this whole area where all the other organelles float around in. That would be the cytoplasm, and then we have the nucleus here in the middle. And it's important to remember that prokaryotic cells have a cytoplasm, but they do not have a nucleus. So their genetic material, their DNA, just floats around inside the cytoplasm. The nucleus is kind of like the brain of the cell. That's where all the information is. So if you can see on the top right, it's surrounded by a nuclear envelope, which has tiny pores or holes that allow small things like RNA to pass in and out of the nucleus, because the chromosomes or the DNA is contained in the middle. And so sometimes we want those messages to be able to come in and out of the cell. But we don't want anything big like a bacteria or something else to be able to get in and alter that DNA, because that's important information. We want to keep it safe. And then the nucleolus is the small, dense region, so that's that purple part in the middle here. That's where ribosomes begin to be made. If you remember, ribosomes are what make proteins. So that's an important structure of the cell, and that's where they're made. So here we have some organelles, or cell structures, that store, clean up, and support the cell. I'm not quite sure why my words are blocked out here, but the vacuole, that is an organelle that stores materials like water, some proteins, and carbohydrates. They're larger in plant cells, so if you can see on the left here, this would be the plant cell. So the vacuole is much bigger in the plant cell than it is in the animal cell, where it's much smaller. This is because this is how plants store their water in case it's a time where it's not raining. It also gives the plant more of a structure, so it can hold its shape. The stems can hold up an entire plant because of these vacuoles. And we have lysosomes, which you can see here, the little purple guys here. So these are things that break down lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins into small molecules that can be used by the cell. So these are the things that are breaking things down so the cell can use them. So they often contain enzymes on the inside. You remember enzymes speed up reactions, help to break things down. So these are kind of like the garbage disposals of the cell. They take care of everything, break everything down. They also get rid of old organelles or parts of the cell that aren't being used anymore and dispose of those. And then down at the bottom here, we've got the cytoskeleton, which help the cell to maintain its shape and also sometimes involved in movement. So it would be these structures here that are kind of holding it together. Just like if you think of the word skeleton, our skeleton holds our body's shape and helps us move. The same thing for the cell. So the cytoskeleton helps the cell to maintain its shape, its structure, and helps it move. Now here are some organelles that help to build proteins. So if you remember from the other day's class, ribosomes are the organelle that builds the proteins, actually puts them together based on the instructions from the DNA. And they're often attached or close by the endoplasmic reticulum, which is this wavy looking yellow thing you can see here. So the ribosomes are the tiny little dots that are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. So as the ribosomes make the proteins, they're put into the endoplasmic reticulum, which kind of puts the proteins together. So the ribosome makes it, but the endoplasmic reticulum is what really puts it together and packages it up the way it's supposed to be. Then the proteins are sent to the Golgi apparatus, which is down here. Again, I'm not sure why my words are blocked out here. But the Golgi apparatus packages and sorts other materials from the endoplasmic reticulum for storage inside the cell or release outside the cell. So the Golgi apparatus is what decides, okay, we have these proteins that were sent by the endoplasmic reticulum, and they need to figure out where they need to go. Do they have a job to do inside the cell, or do they need to be released out of the cell? So that's what the Golgi apparatus does. So maybe this is an easier way to see this, the synthesis and packaging of proteins. So the first step, the proteins are assembled in the ribosome, which is right here. This tiny little guy here is the ribosome. So the proteins are made, then they're sent inside the endoplasmic reticulum where they're kind of packaged, put together the way they're supposed to. Then they are sent in a vesicle into the Golgi apparatus. The Golgi apparatus decides where it needs to go, packages the protein, and either maybe it has a use inside the cell, so it sends it inside the cell, or it sends it out of the cell for a job elsewhere. So all of these organelles work together to help get our proteins where they need to be, to help our cells run smoothly. Now we have organelles that capture and release energy. So the chloroplasts would be one example. So they capture energy from the sun and convert it into food that contains chemical energy in a process called photosynthesis. So what we're doing what the plant cell is doing in these chloroplasts is they're using energy from the sun to make things like starch. So it stores the energy in a form called starch, and then the mitochondria, when the animal cells break down the starch, so the chemical energy stored in food, another word for that is the starch, when it breaks down that starch, it turns it into compounds more convenient for the cell to use, like ATP. So that's the form of energy that the cell can use for all its cell functions, whether it's making proteins, breaking things down in the lysosomes, whether it's moving. Anything the cell does requires energy. This is where it gets that energy. So the cellular boundaries are another very important part of the cell. A cell membrane regulates what enters and leaves the cell and also protects and supports the cell. So these are the outside boundaries of an animal cell, but they're also contained in plant and prokaryotic cells. They're just right underneath the cell wall. So that would be this structure here. And many cells, including most prokaryotes and plant cells, also produce a strong supporting layer around the membrane called the cell wall. So that would be this larger, harder structure here, and that protects the cell a little bit more and gives it a bit of a stronger structural support. The cell membrane are composed of a double-layered sheath called a lipid bilayer. If you remember, lipids are fats, And this gives cell membranes a flexible structure and forms a strong barrier between the cell and its surroundings. So if you can see, this would be a picture of a cell, and this is the zoomed in version of the cell membrane. So we have the lipids here. Remember when we learned about lipids, they have the head with the tails. Those would be the fatty acid tails and the glycerol head. So that structure is what holds the membrane together. And then there's other things inside the membrane like these protein channels or these carbohydrates. These help things get in and out of the cell that the cell needs, but also protect from larger things that the cell does not want to get in. And just a little review of the properties of lipids, because this will help us understand how the cell membrane keeps its structure. Remember, the fatty acid portion of the lipids is hydrophobic, which means water hating. So that would be this bottom region. And the opposite end of the molecule is hydrophilic, which means it loves water. So that would be this top region, the glycerol portion. So when the lipids are mixed with water, the hydrophobic fatty acid tails here cluster together. So you can see the tails on both sides of this membrane are pointing inward. So they're attracted to each other, and the hydrophilic heads, which are attracted to water, face the outside. So you can see the hydrophilic heads are on the outside of the membrane because there's water outside our cells and inside of our cells. Remember, we are made of water. Most living things are made mostly of water. So there's water outside and inside the cell. The plasma fluid membrane inside is made of water as well. So this results in a lipid bilayer, which forms a nice protective layer around the cell. So that's all for organelles and different types of cells. If you have any questions, please feel free to review this, rewind and view this video again. Otherwise, you can ask questions in class, and I hope this helped you understand a little bit more about cell organelles.